Okay, well, welcome everybody to today's session. I'm excited to see my friends, and so thank you for joining with me. I hope today will be helpful. We're going to be talking about something that is discussed over and over and over again, and in and continues to have direct relevance for the for how we think about the Arab-Israeli conflict, and particularly Palestinian-Israeli conflict, which is the Six-Day War, oftentimes referred to as the Naksa, or the setback, from particularly from Egyptian and the Arab side, but uh, to be distinguished from the Nakba, which was the Great Catastrophe of 1948. So we're talking about the Six-Day War, and as we talked about last week, there are a lot of moments in the decade of the 1950s between essentially the end of the War of Independence in 48 and the beginning of this war in 67 that we really, those 9 years that were really critical. But I want to just zero in now a little bit on sort of highlighting a number of key moments leading right up to the 1967 war. And then we'll have time towards the second half of the class to really think about the very differing approaches or narratives that Israel, Palestinians, Egyptians have. And then hopefully we'll have a little bit of time to sort of pull back and do, and I can offer some analysis as well of how to think about this in light of the development of the Arab-Israeli conflict. So first question is what, the kind of thing that we want to at least get on the table is what led right to the 67 war. And then, of course, as you all are aware of, Israel won this massive victory in 1967 in 6 days, hence the name, the Six-Day War. How did that happen, right? Why was Israel so just dominant in this place? Likewise, it's worth sort of setting out as a headline we want to think about is the Arab response after the war in the city of Khartoum was the Khartoum Declaration, which was no recognition of Israel, no peace with Israel, no negotiation with Israel after Israel's massive victory. It's also worth noting, as I was intimating here at the beginning, that this war really leads to the creation of the what we see now, we oftentimes refer to as the occupation, Israel's occupation of the West Bank. And we say it as the occupation, at least from my perspective, reason I use that term is because there's still this UN Resolution 242, which we're going to talk about, which says that Israel will give up land that it captured as a result of this war. And there's a lot of differing interpretations of what that requires from the perspective of Israel, for example. And we'll talk about this at greater length when we talk about the narratives. From Israel's perspective, that would require an agreement for peace with an individual country. Then land will be returned. Peace agreement will precede the return of the land. From the perspective of particularly Egypt and other Arab countries after this war, no, Jordan included, no, you give us our land back first, then we'll start to talk and negotiate peace. So there's this very wide divergence in interpretation, but the core ongoing, issue of this land, right? Because a lot of the Arab-Israeli conflicts about a lot of other things, ideology, as nationalisms, competing nationalisms, but it's also about actual land. And in 1967, the outcome of that war just highlights that. And it really sets the stage all the way for the 50 years since 60, all the way up to now, right? So one other thing that I'm going to say, which is not news to you if you've been following along in my class, is that the Cold War between the US and the Soviets becomes very sharply defined as part of this 1967 war. And one other thing I just should mention is that the Palestinian liberation movement emerges as a central part of this story in this period of time, just leading up to the 67 war, starting in 64, and in 68, there's the Palestinian Liberation Organization's Declaration of Independence, where they refused to recognize Israel. And that doesn't change until 1993. So finally, I should take note that, as we mentioned last week, thinking about Israel-Syrian conflict in the northern border of Israel, southern border of Syria, eastern border north of Jordan, natural resources, in particular water, becomes part of a long list of issues that divide the Arabs and Israelis. And I would argue that as we get into this era of global warming, a desert place, Middle East, issues about water are going to become increasingly important. Natural resources like oil have been important, as we recognize, but few people think about water as being so powerful. So I want to call attention to that as well. So in 1967, Israel defeated every kind of Arab nation decisively. It defeated conservative nations like Saudi Arabia and radical nations like Syria, traditional nations, revolutionary nations. Egypt, Syria, and Jordanian armies were completely totaled. Nasser, who was at his height of his power right before 1960, this war, was severely diminished. And Israel ends up with 3 times the land it had at the start of this war. After this war, for the Arabs, it's no longer about 1948. I'm going to leave Palestinians aside for a second. But for the Arab as a whole, it's no longer about 1948. It's about the lands that they view Israel as taking from them in this war. Now, at the global level, systemic level, in the Cold War, there are major conflicts that really play right into this. So 1961, there's the Berlin crisis. 1962, there's the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Bay of Pigs crisis in 63. And then there's this engaged arms race, this huge arms race between the US and the Soviets. And all over the globe, they're trying to assert their dominance. Arab-Israeli dynamics are part of this, at this strategic level, are part of this competition. Now, the Arabs were not united. Despite the best effort of Nasser to create a pan-Arabic movement, there are different kinds of Arab countries. And one way, simple way to sort of think about it is, on the one hand, there are the radical revolutionary, populist, socialist regimes that are allied with the Soviet Union. That's Egypt, predominantly. And then on the other side is Saudi Arabia, conservative, more traditional, reactionary, allied with the United States. And so you can see, and so Egypt and Syria, Yemen, right? There's a civil war we're going to talk about in Yemen that sort of heightens this Cold War. But all over this conflict that we might think of as a conflict between Israel and her Arab neighbors is the larger project of this conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. Now, that didn't mean that Arab countries weren't trying to unite together, right? This is the period of Arab symmetry. The Arab League had repeated meetings to try to come to some kind of unified position on a number of different issues. And Egypt, with Nasser at the head of it, was the dominant voice at those meetings. Palestinians were almost not represented at all. And so here you see the birth of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or the PLO, and also in 1964, authored and supported by Egypt, and also a number of smaller guerrilla movements that were very frustrated at the limits of the Arabization of the conflict between Israel and Arab countries. It wasn't helping their cause. So let me just take a few minutes before I get into some maps and things like that, and just talk a little bit about the main developments of the 67 war. Leading up to that 67 war and from the mid-60s on, the phases of the actual crisis itself, the 67 war, and what happens immediately afterwards. Now, these involve that after the Suez Crisis of 1956, how the Cold War sort of configured the region of Israel, Palestine, Egypt. Nasserism in Egypt, and the rise of the Ba'ath Party in Syria and also in Iraq. Ba'ath Party, a socialist party that sought alliances with Nasser. So you have Egypt and to the south of Israel, and you have Syria to the northeast of Israel, suddenly becoming potentially allies, and eventually becoming allies in 1958, more than an alliance, a single entity with the United Arab Republic, around this common political identity, the socialist, radical, anti-Western party. I want to talk a little bit to set a stage, because we're going to get into this a lot in the years in subsequent lectures, just to understand how Lebanon in the late 50s, just north of Israel, right, on the northern border of Israel, goes into crisis. Lebanon is not part of the 67 war, but there's a crisis that proceeds in 1958, 59, 60 that we need to be aware of to sort of historically think about as we go on. So I want to talk a little bit about that. I already mentioned Yemen's civil war as a key flashpoint between the two groups of countries, the Saudi Arabia on one hand and Egypt on the other hand. And then we'll sort of also talk a little bit about the creation of Fatah, which is the party that becomes, it means literally in Arabic, the movement for the liberation of Palestine. This emerging in 1964. So thinking about Egypt for starters, Egypt gets, in terms of the Cold War, Egypt is getting 31% of all Soviet economic assistance in the entire region. So 1/3 of it's coming to Egypt. About 50%, not quite, of all military aid to all Arab countries from the Soviets is going directly to Egypt. If you add in Syria and Iraq, we're talking about 80% of all military assistance from the Soviets going to those three countries in that region. On the other side of that, of course, is the United States. I mentioned last week seeking out a pact between Turkey and Iraq, Saudi Arabia, the Baghdad pact, to agree, and then the Eisenhower Doctrine, where President Eisenhower said that if any of our allies in the region feel that they are being attacked, that the United States will aid them, right? This is an explicit endorsement of the idea that Arab politics is part of the Cold War. 98% of U.S. military aid in the Middle East went to Israel, of course, but also to Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Turkey. So let that sink in for a second. We know what has happened over the many decades since then. But at this point in time, in 1957, U.S. has got its hands deep in it, right? Deep in it. One of the things that's really kind of interesting about Egypt is playing both sides of the table. Egypt, Nasser recognizes, I mean, he's no dummy. Like, you can say a lot about Nasser. He's brilliant. And he understands that, hey, the Soviets and the United States are fighting. Let me get something from each. So he goes to the Soviets for arms. Remember last week we talked about in 1955, this massive arms deal that comes through the Czech Republic to Nasser on the eve of the 56 Suez Crisis. Well, that's, you know, and then, so he's getting arms from the Soviets, and that just continues, but he's getting US support because the United States says, we don't want to alienate Egypt. First of all, they got a lot of oil. Secondly, if we can woo Nasser away from the Soviets, what an incredible coup that could be for US foreign policy in the Middle East. So they don't want to really alienate Nasser if Nasser seems to be open to it. And so Nasser's seeking out economic assistance. And there's this sort of this slogan that, you know, Nasser got arms from the communists, but wheat from the United States. Finally, there is this nuclear dimension. As I mentioned, at the end of the 56, right? So when you think about the Suez War, France and Britain, seeing Egypt as threatening their trade route through the Suez Canal and pushing the British out, France comes to, they solicit Israel's military help in fighting that war to push back and to open up the Suez Canal, and they're successful. In that process, Israel acquires a nuclear reactor from France, which it goes to work on immediately in the city of Dimona with a secret, not so secret anymore, but secret project to create a nuclear weapon. So this kind of starts to freak out Egypt and other countries in the area who aren't really quite sure if Israel is going to be aggressive with that. Now, Egypt's own internal spies are telling Nasser Israel has no intention of using their nuclear weapon for anything other than deterrence and defense. It's not a threat. But Nasser knows that, but the public doesn't necessarily, like some other leaders don't necessarily know that. And as this starts to leak out in the Arab press, there's a lot of nerves about, you know, how powerful Israel is becoming. Now, this is a period of time that's also the 1960s, right? And there's a spread of radicalism. There's the anti-war movement in the United States. There's anti-colonial movements, Algerian resistance, right? Now was also a big part of this. And Nasser was calling for, resistance in the Arab world to the West. He's talking about resurrecting the Arab Nada, or the Renaissance of the 19th century, at the time when Arab nationalism was born. And so Egypt reaches out to Syria and says, let's create a pan-Arabic government. And they, for a very brief 3 years, Egypt and Syria are unified together in the United Arab Republic, or the UAR, from 1958 to 1961. So just thinking about a growing kind of anti-Western power, capitalism, socialism was growing in its power all over the place. Anti-colonialism is growing, and that's a big piece of what's happening moving into the 60s, into the late 60s, not just in Europe, not just in the United States, but also in the Middle East. So the Ba'ath Party, I won't talk a lot about this, but when Egypt and Syria become a single state, the United Arab Republic, Nasser becomes the president of that United Arab Republic. Its capital is in Cairo. It's in Egypt. There is a response on the more conservative side of the Arab world when Iraq and Jordan say, "What? You guys are together without us? Okay, we're going to create the Arab Federation of Iraq and Jordan." And then there is a series of Iraqi revolutions that sort of really screw up this effort for Jordan to have a partner with Iraq to balance the power of Syria and Egypt, who have joined forces. After a series of, I don't want to get into all the details, it's pretty messy and very bloody, but Iraq basically sets up a new Islamic state, very, very unstable one, and a Ba'athist regime eventually replaces that Islamic state, and that brings Iraq potentially into the orbit of Syria. So there's a lot of instability in the surrounding Arab world. Let me talk a little bit about the northern border of Israel, Lebanon. One of the things to think about Lebanon is it is the conflict that will erupt in Lebanon multiple times in the next 30, 40 years from this history. Really sort of, we start to see it erupting in 1958. The roots of that conflict go back to a religious conflict between Muslims and Christians. France had always seen itself as the power, the Western power with the most influence in Lebanon. And then for a long time, right there, that's where their mandate was. In the 1950s, the Lebanese government was run by Camille Chamoun, who was a Maronite Christian. The Maronite Christians had power in Lebanon because of their connection with France. Chamoun's term was going to expire in 1958, and like all good rulers facing their decline of power, he decides to actually rewrite the Constitution so he can stay in power, right? So Syria, Egypt think that that's messed up. They think this is a move by France to establish more authority in the Arab world. And Chamoun's popularity is sinking and sinking and sinking. And the Muslims in Lebanon are very, very angry about this. There had been this uneasy pact between the Christian Maronite minority and the Muslim majority in Lebanon, where the Christians said, okay, Lebanon will be an Arab country, we'll accept an Arab identity for Lebanon. And in return, the Muslims accepted that the French mandate borders of Lebanon would stay and that Lebanon would not be merged with Syria. But when Nasser rose, all that seemed to fall apart. There was growing Lebanese Muslim support for this pan-Arab cause. And when Egypt and Syria formed the United Arab Republic in 1958, There was an assassination of a Western journalist, Nasib al-Matni, in Lebanon, who, by the way, had been writing critical stories about Shamoun. And Eisenhower saw the whole thing falling apart and sent US troops to Lebanon to intervene, to stop the fall of the Shamoun government, the Western government, the rise of a Muslim government, potentially allied with Egypt and Syria. When the US troops arrive in Lebanon in late 58, the Soviets are on alert, right? The United States is clearly now militarily present in the Middle East in a way that is not all about Israel at all, something else, right? The whole thing gets resolved momentarily because another Christian gets elected who is willing to permit more Muslim and Druze opposition to stay in the government, and the US pulls out of this. But I wanted to call attention to this because while this new power sharing agreement in Lebanon is in place, it's very unstable. And it's going to emerge the United States, Christians, and Muslims in Lebanon. That's going to emerge as a powder keg in the coming decades, just north of Israel. Just wanted to say a couple more words about now another country bordering on Israel, Syria. 1961, the United Arab Republic falls apart. Syria really was never fully comfortable with Nasser being in charge of the Syrian military. The United Arab Republic that started in 1958 between Egypt and Syria. And by the way, I want you to picture that in your mind for a second. Egypt to the southwest of Israel. Syria's to the northeast of Israel. And they're two gigantic countries, both probably 5 times the size of Israel geographically. And all of a sudden they're united politically. And in fact, Nasser, who had just had a war essentially with Britain, France, and Israel in 1956, was in charge of this government. So this is very, very disconcerting to Israel in the late 50s, early 60s. But Syrian armed forces had an armed uprising against the Union because they felt that Nasser wasn't listening to them and hadn't given them enough power over their own forces. And so for another couple of years, conservative politicians in Syria ran the country, helped by the military. But then there's a coup in Syria, mirroring the repeated coups in Iraq for the Ba'athist parties, and the Syrian Ba'athists are in charge. And in 1966, the Syrian Ba'ath Party splits up, and Salah Hadid claims power in another coup in Syria and connects Syria very clearly and very explicitly with the Soviet Union. And they also sign a mutual defense pact with Egypt, and that's going to be really important. So when Hadid, spelled Jadid, signs this pact between Israel and Jordan, between Syria and Egypt, that promises that if one's attacked, the other one will defend them. Syria is saying that to Egypt, Egypt saying that to Syria. Two other really important pieces before I start talking about the actual war in 67. There's a civil war in Yemen, which we can look at as demonstrating a convergence of global read Cold War regional, meaning conservative Arab republics versus more radical republics. All of that comes to converge together, those politics, in this civil war that emerges in Yemen. That war breaks out in 1962. And the Saudis are on one side of the civil war, and Egypt is on the other side of the civil war. The Saudis support the colonial remnant in Yemen, the royalists. Egypt support the radicals, right? Not mysterious to us how that would emerge. Now, of course, the Cold War makes this very intense because the Saudis are backed by the United States. Egypt is backed by the Soviets. So we have a civil war in Yemen illustrating the split in the Arab world, illustrating and drawing down into it the Cold War. It essentially becomes a proxy conflict between Saudi Arabia and its allies, Jordan and Iran and Morocco, which back the traditional royal government on the one hand, and on the other hand, Egypt, along with Algeria, backing the Republicans. The most heavily invested, though, were Saudi Arabia and Egypt in particular gets really knee deep. I shouldn't say knee deep, shoulder deep into this. Egypt had as many as 70,000 troops of their own in the Yemen civil war. It was oftentimes referred to at that time as Nasser's Vietnam. That he kept getting in and in and in and he couldn't get out. In 1965, in Saudi Arabia, there was an agreement that brokered a ceasefire and an Egyptian withdrawal from the civil war. But that only comes after the 1967 war with the Six-Day War that we're going to be talking about. I just want to also remind us about what I was talking about last week in terms of water, which is that the use of the Jordan River in particular, which originates at the border of Israel, the border of Syria, Israel, and Jordan, becomes a big piece of this conflict. The United States had a plan to divide up the use of the water between Israel and Jordan, but it was never implemented. This was in the 1950s. And in 1963, this becomes a really big issue as Israel says, okay, we're going to build a national water carrier where we're going to divert a huge amount of the Lake Tiberias, which is a freshwater source on its northeast border and bordering with Syria. We're going to divert a huge amount we're going to create this water project to bring it east and south along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, all the way down into the Negev to irrigate all of those areas. The Arabs in their summits are very and in 1964, their summit Egypt commit, can you guys hear me okay?
You were frozen, but you seem to be okay now.
Sorry about that. I just got a sign that says my internet was going. If it continues, I'll move to another room where it's better, okay? So the Arab Summit in Cairo in 1964, the Arab League gets together and they say water is this incredibly important issue and Israel is the enemy. They literally say that, and that the Arabs need to unite because Israel is going to strangle us. They also create this Arab military headed by an Egyptian lieutenant general, and they come up with this plan to use the Jordan River in a coordinated way, right? So including Jordanian, Egyptian, Syrian, and Lebanese governments all sign on to how we're going to use our water. Syria has the endorsement of all these governments, and they start to divert a river that flows into Lake Tiberias. It flows into the Jordan, I'm sorry. The river Banias, Banias. And Israel counters by obstructing the Syrian work. And it starts blowing up some of the machinery that Syria brings in there to divert the Banias River. Guess who's in charge of this? Yitzhak Rabin. So Lieutenant General Yitzhak Rabin says, if Syria continues to try to divert this, Israel would overthrow Syria. That's what he says, literally. So there's another Arab summit in 1964 in Alexandria, Egypt. And in that summit, they talk a little bit about water, but then they talk about the quote unquote Arab liberation of Palestine. All of a sudden, Palestine, which has been off of the radar screen, so to speak, of all these Arab countries for quite some time, water sort of brings them together, this effort to counter Israel's national water carrier project, Syria's effort to divert Banias River. And now they're talking about the liberation of Palestine. But Palestinian young people had already come to the conclusion that the Arab countries weren't really going to help them with their conflict with Israel. In 1959, they start this Fatah organization, the Movement for the Liberation of Palestine. And they envision this as leading the quote unquote armed struggle. That's really critical because they were right from the start committed to an armed struggle with Israel. And it starts in 1965. Fatah was joined, by the way, Fatah is the party that Yasser Arafat comes out of, who's going to be the PLO's big leader, the really big leader. But we're going to wait until 68 to see him emerge. Fatah is joined by other Palestinian organizations, and they're really inspired by the radical Algerian War of Independence, they're inspired by the Viet Cong, they can't believe it. This little ragtag bunch of guerrillas is winning a war against the United States. And if that can happen, then we can win a war against Israel. And in 1964, in that Arab summit in Alexandria, the PLO is established with the blessings of Nasser. The PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, also is not just a movement, it has a military arm. And that military arm functions under the Egyptian command. So it's all centered in Egypt now. PLO in Cairo, PLO military arm in Cairo under Egypt, and Nasser handpicks Ahmad Shakiri, who had been the leader of the old Palestinian government to lead the PLO. So Shuqayri, Shakiri becomes the first leader of the PLO.
You said it correct the first time, Shakuri.
Shakuri. Okay, thank you. Thank you. My Arabic is not, I have no Arabic, just faking.
I have no Arabic, but I was in the Middle East at the time.
Okay, all right. So Jordan looks at all this. I mean, they're at the Arab Summit too, they're not, for the very first time, because they see Nasser coming out and giving his blessing to the emergence of this Palestinian organization, PLO, Jordan decides to, quote unquote, permit Arab Palestinian nationalism. A year later, in 1965, the Arab League has another meeting, this time in Casablanca, and there's a Palestinian legislature, the Palestinian National Council, the PNC, is formed in 1965. And they issue a declaration called the Arab Solidarity Declaration that says, all Arab countries have to work together for the, quote, protection of the Arab nation and for the liberation of Palestine from Zionist occupation, unquote. Here we're hearing the Palestinian activists seeking to link the cause of Arab nationalism and pan-Arab nationalism with the cause of the Palestinians. On the Gaza Strip, Egypt works in the mid-1960s to create a local legislative body and a basic law that reflects frustration with the lack of action to liberate Palestine. But the Palestinians, despite getting some headway from the Arab League, both from Egypt, who's the most powerful actor here, Nasser, and from the Arab League more generally, they are realizing that the Arab nations have other priorities. Nasser told them privately, I'm not trying to liberate Palestine. My priorities are in Egypt first, my Egyptian economy, and Nasser is preoccupied with Yemen in 1967 at the time of the outbreak of the Israel-Arab War, the Six-Day War. And this war, basically, and the Arab-Israeli conflict more generally, ruins all of Nasser's agenda, his pan-Arab agenda, and his regional dreams as well. For Jordan, leading into the 1967 war, Jordan has two concerns, or Israel has two concerns, or let's put it this way, there's two aspects to their relationships. One is there's a lot of attacks from Jordan into Israel, cross-border Palestinian militant attacks, and Israel's retaliating against those attacks into Jordan. So you've got a lot of military action there. A second piece, though, is you've got a dialogue happening between the Prime Minister of Israel, Levi Eshkol, and King Hussein, who also meets with Golda Meir, who's the foreign minister for Israel at that time. They get together in Paris and they're trying to figure out what does Jordan want? How can Israel relate to Jordan? See, what makes Jordan unique here is that it has a Western orientation. Jordan's getting its arms from Western countries. It's getting its arms from the United States. And King Hussein has a house in London, right? He's going to London and he's a welcome visitor in the United States, in the White House, regular visitor to the US Embassy and Jordanian Embassy in the United States. So there's this movement to try to peel off Jordan from the Arab League by Israel, with the United States supporting this. Which brings up this issue I just mentioned, arms. There is a regional arms race that is breaking out in the Middle East. The US is giving Israel arms starting in 1962. There's a $23 million deal. That sounds like a little bit to us now, but it's 1962, of Hawk anti-aircraft missiles. In 1965, the United States gets M48 tanks to Israel. Britain also provides 300 tanks to Israel. Meanwhile, the Soviets are supplying Egypt with fighter aircraft, Soviet fighter aircraft, MiGs, and surface-to-air missile systems, SAMs. And they also are helping Iraq with some of that, and with Syria with anti-ship missiles. And then in light of all of this, there's also the nuclear issue, which I mentioned before, right? It was revealed in December of 1960, right, as we get into 61, that the French had given Israel a nuclear reactor, and Egypt is trying to get German scientists to supply them with ballistic missiles. And so there's this growing concern of the United States that there's going to be a nuclear arms race potentially in the Middle East, and they're committed. The United States is committed to stopping that from happening. They don't really look too kindly on the fact that France gave this nuclear reactor to Israel, because that could set off a nuclear arms race if Egypt ever gets its hands on the capacity, if it ever develops the capacity to have a nuclear weapon. Now we've got a nuclear arms race in the Middle East. So what happens to get us into this war? I thought, rather than me, I can give you the details of the history, but I thought, why don't I open it up for a few minutes and just ask you what you know about the lead up to the war, or the actual conduct of the war. What happens? What precipitates the war? How does it go? How does it occur? The 6-day war. And I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to show some. Hopefully Marcia can hear me and can give me some screen sharing. But in the meantime, go ahead.
I can do that, Scott.
I'm gonna come to you in a second, Michael, because I know you know it, and everyone knows.
Exactly. Take me last, please.
Okay. All right. So I want to hear just what you guys kind of know and where there's holes there, and then I'm going to try to fill that in before we get into our narratives. Okay.
Yes. Maybe I'm not sure I can. Hang on.
Oh, you're trying to share my screen. Okay, that's okay. Don't worry about that.
I'll give you.
If you give me a minute, I'll take a break in a minute. Hang on a second. I'll be right back, and I'm gonna yell downstairs to Marcia to open up the room so I can host share. Okay, I'll be right there.
Okay, because I cannot do it. I do a lot of things, but not that.
This is the coffee break.
Coffee break.
Yes.
Yeah. Get your email, Donna, and I will send you.
Okay. All right. Hopefully this will work. Okay.
Oh.
Yes. There we go. All right. All right. I thought it'd be useful for us to look at the maps here. Hang on. Let me get out of my email. And here we go. So here's Nasser becoming a hero after the Suez Crisis, right? And he's at the top of his power. We'll just set the stage a little bit here. Here he is forging agreement with these with Jordan, a defense agreement. He already has a mutual defense agreement with Syria as well. Just to highlight a couple things I want to point out before the war, Israel is very vulnerable, right? This is all part of Jordan, right? So you can see there's a very, very narrow area here of geography between these major cities and Jordan, okay? Israel's hearing a lot of anti-Israel rhetoric in the Arab press, not the least of which is from Nasser, who's saying we're going to push the Jews into the sea. Mm-hmm. So much people are freaking out, and they're actually digging their own graves. This is in Tel Aviv. in 1960, right before the war. Okay, so I'm not going to show that video, but you can look at the map and go ahead, Robin. I wanted to just have this map here to show it to you so you can talk a little bit about it.
Yeah. So all I know is that Egypt starts amassing troops at their border, at the border between Egypt and Israel. Israel is getting intelligence that Egypt is about to strike. And so Israel decides to strike preemptively. And as a result of that, as you said, like Egypt and Sinai have this have this joint. I don't remember how you said it, but they've agreed that if one of us gets attacked, then we're both attacked, and so then Syria comes into the fray, and then Lebanon starts moving in, and so Israel then, I don't remember if it was Lebanon versus Jordan that attacked first, and then Israel, I think it was Jordan that attacked first, and then Israel.
Lebanon stays out.
Lebanon stays out. Okay, so then Jordan came in and attacked Israel, and so Israel sent planes out to Jordan, and so so Israel saw the whole thing as like a cause belli, like there was a, they saw activity that convinced them they were at risk, and so they reacted preemptively again with regard to Egypt, and that's all I know.
No, that's you got a lot of it correct. I mean, some of the players a little bit backwards. It was actually Syria, but Egypt that got information that Syria was being attacked, but because they had this mutual defense treaty. But Syria was trying to tell Egypt, we're not being attacked, and Egypt's own people, his own military people, are telling Nasser, there is no attack, there's nothing. But Egypt amasses its troops on the border of Israel. You're absolutely right about that. And Israel looks at that, and as you saw on the previous slide, right? They're scared. They're scared. Now, maybe the leadership isn't quite as scared, but the people are. Yes, Michael, I want to give you.
Okay, so I'll give you my credentials. I happen to be at the time working for the Israeli Ministry of Defense in New York City. So I have first-hand information. Contrary to what I heard from you, Egypt and Syria and the rest of the Arab countries always blame the issue of the Palestinians as the reason for their local problems. This was the cause that got their support from their people. It's always been like that. So what happened just before the 67 war, Nasser, having internal problems, he decided to, as most dictators do, to divert the attention, to wag the tail of the dog by getting into a fight with Israel. The Sinai Peninsula at the time was was controlled by the United Nations after the 56 war. The United Nations was stationed there, and to the surprise of the world and Israel, he ordered them to move out, and they did with no negotiation whatsoever. They immediately moved out. So Israel, of course, now with belligerent declarations, they were very worried. The next thing that he did once Nasser moved inside, he closed the Straits of Tiran. Okay, so the navigation, the Israeli shipping could not go south from Eilat. Okay, and at the same time, the Russians started to propagate allegations that Israel is going to attack Syria. And the Israeli government invited the Syrian ambassador, let's go to the Syrian border and let's find out if this is true. And they refused to do it. And so the war was coming, and there was a decision at one point to strike first. That is the reason. And those pictures that you saw there, they were building these defenses because they were very worried about being overrun by these very strong armies, because they were so much superior in all military equipment to the Israeli military. And as you said, Israel dug in Tel Aviv 10,000 graveyards for 10,000 casualties. They were expecting many casualties. So that is how it started. And I'll be more than glad to answer any other questions that I remember.
Well, I think all of the stuff that you guys have been saying is important. Let me sort of fill out, because everything that Michael said is absolutely correct. So in 66, the tensions between Israel and its neighbors are escalating. You're getting all these Palestinian attacks from Jordan and from Gaza, and Israel's retaliating into Jordan. In November of 1966, 3 Israeli soldiers were killed by a mine on Israel's border with Jordan, and Israel responds against the Jordanian village of Samu, which is just south of Hebron, and 21 Jordanian soldiers and civilians are killed. 37 are wounded. And it happened on King Hussein's birthday. Now, Hussein didn't really want to have a war with Israel and was not interested in being dragged into this Syrian-Egyptian defense pact. But now radical states are looking at Hussein and saying, you have no backbone. You're not willing to respond to the Israeli attack on Jordan, and all you're trying to do is avoid war with Israel. On the border so this pushes and puts pressure on Jordan to reconsider their reluctance to be involved here. On the border with Syria, there's an air battle that's taking place in April, with Israel shooting down 6 Syrian fighter jets. Egypt, despite the fact that they had this mutual defense pact, I should say, stayed out of it. Nasser gets slammed for not responding in the Arab media. And so this ratchets up the warmongering, and tensions get tighter. And as Michael points out, I think rightly, Nasser feels his internal criticism that he's not been stronger in addressing this. In May of 1967, this is where it gets critical. Soviets, as Mike points out, tell Egypt, Israel has a major troop buildup on the Syrian border, which they didn't have. Nasser was told by the United Nations and his own officers on the border that this isn't true, but he decides to move all his troops into the Sinai. And that's when he tells the United Nations emergency forces that are still there as a buffer zone after the 56 war to get out. Actually, he says, can you stand down? Go into the cities. Don't get out of the area in the buffer zone. And they say, okay, and they leave. They just leave. So Egypt moves all of his troops, or doesn't move all of his troops. He moves a bunch of troops into Sharm el-Sheikh down here. Sorry, at the point of the Sinai Peninsula, and closes the Straits of Tiran. Now, what's really important is that obviously this blocks Israel's port of Eilat, but it's very important because Israel said after the 56 war that any blockade of those straits would be seen, and they were crystal clear. Anytime Egypt ever did that again, because they've done it before, if they do it again, we're going to see that as a declaration of war.
Can I have a word on that?
Yeah.
It is the international law. This is what America is doing right now with China. Navigation over the sea, the clear sea, blocking navigation in the international waterways is tantamount to a declaration of war.
Right. And so the United States and Britain back Israel, and the U.S. Sixth Fleet moves into the Mediterranean. It's getting pretty ominous at this point. Now, the Soviets back Nasser, and they block in the United Nations Security Council, they block any condemnation of Egypt's actions. Jordan's King Hussein at that moment goes to Cairo, and instead of getting Nasser to stand down, he signs a defense pact with Nasser, handing over command over the Jordanian army, which is probably the most powerful army other than the Egyptian army. The total command of that is handed over to Nasser. He also says to Iraq, you can move your troops into Jordan on the border with Israel. So Israel is looking at all of this and they see all of this as ominous. In terms of the United States and Israel, their relationship is undergoing some important developments. Prime Minister Eshkol wants his foreign minister, Abba Iban, to get the U.S. To agree that an attack on Israel would be considered an attack on the United States, invoking the Eisenhower Doctrine. But President Johnson, right, it's Kennedy and it's Johnson. So President Johnson says to Iban, tell Israel to back off. We don't really want them to attack Egypt. A week later, the head of Mossad, of the Israeli CIA, the Mossad, right, Meir Amit, goes to meet with American officials, and he says, "Look, I'm not looking for America to intervene. We're not looking for America, but we do want the United States to do three things. One, get in the way of the Soviets. Don't let the Soviets interfere in this conflict. Secondly, let's please support Israel in the United Nations. And thirdly, help us with arms. We need weapons." And Amit concludes that the United States did not approve of a preemptive attack, but it didn't forbid it either. And that is the yellow light that LBJ reportedly said, Israel we're not going to tell Israel what to do. That's Israel's its own business.
Can I add one word on this?
Yes.
So I remember it very clearly. What happened was Johnson sent 3 warnings to the Israeli governments not to start the war, not to be the first one to shoot first. And he said that he's giving him a chance to put together an international warships to keep the waterways open. And on the 4th one, when he wasn't able to, he wrote to Israel that he failed, which was signaled, start the war.
Okay, well, that piece I don't know about, so that's
exactly.
But I do know that LBJ ultimately was very supportive of Israel here. But in the middle here, I mean, he's like, there's a Cold War also, right? There's a whole lot of other concerns here that are really important. Now, another dimension is French support. Israel, so at first, by the way, I will highlight something that Michael said that is important, which is it's not like the US says, we got your back no matter what. You do what you need to do. If Egypt's got troops amassed on your border and you're being threatened, if you have to do no. The United States is unclear about the kind of support it's going to offer. It's not going to stop Israel, but it's not offering it's lukewarm, its support at this point. And that's really important because when we get to the narratives, and France, which had been Israel's supporter ever since 56, they had a new leader in town, right? There's a new boss, new sheriff, Charles de Gaulle, who basically was very critical of Israel and said, look, we're getting out of Algeria and we don't want to be connected to Israel. And de Gaulle tells Abba Eban, do not strike first, explicitly. So France is telling Israel, we're not going to back you here. So what happens? As Robin pointed out, on June 5th, there's a massive Israeli attack on the Egyptian, on Egypt, air attack on Egypt. And right away, in the first few hours, Israel destroys 80% of Egypt's bomber fleet and 55% of its fighters. It guarantees Israel air superiority. Israel at that moment tells Jordan, don't get involved. King Hussein had his military bombing that I talked about before, and 4 days in, Israel had captured East Jerusalem, so Jordan ignores that. He starts to have his military bomb Jerusalem and Netanya, northern Israel. And so Israel's at war with Jordan and with Egypt. And 4 days into the war, Israel had captured East Jerusalem and the West Bank.
Can I say the word about Jordan? Okay, so what happened with Jordan was that Israel, through the United Nations and the United States, sent a secret message to Hussein: don't engage in the war, and we will not attack you. And he ignored it, like he said. And when the Jordanian ignored it, it was a clear sign for Israel to take back old Jerusalem.
At least that's exactly what happened. That's for sure. I don't know if it was.
Well, I was there. As I told you, I was working for the Israeli Defense Ministry in New York City at the time.
Okay, so they go ahead, they do that, and they take Gaza from Egypt and the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. Now they're going after Syria's advantages in the north, on the Golan Heights. 6 days after the war started, on June 11th, they take the Golan Heights, and they agree to a ceasefire with Syria, and the war is over. 6 days. You can see what happens here in terms of the size of Israel from this to all of this. There's a couple of things I should point out before I get into the Israeli narrative. One is, right after the war, there's the Khartoum resolution, which I mentioned before. A couple things to say about the Khartoum resolution. It happens on September 1st of 1967. It unites all the Arabs that were fighting with each other before. The conservatives, the radicals, they're all together across the Cold War divide. And they say, this is an all Arab issue, liberation of the territories that are now quote unquote occupied by Israel. And they all say, we reject peace with Israel. We reject recognizing Israel as a country, and we will not negotiate with Israel. The three no's: no peace, no recognition, and no negotiations. They also say in that Khartoum resolution that we insist, quote unquote, on the rights of the Palestinian people in their own country. So UN resolution 242 comes just after the war, and it is unanimously adopted by the United Nations Security Council. And it basically says the following things. I think I have it in here. No, I don't. Sorry. But it says that, first of all, it says there's territory that is acquired by war is inadmissible, and there needs to be they need to be working for a just and lasting peace in which every state in the area can live in security. Secondly, that Israel's armed forces must withdraw from, quote unquote, from territories occupied in the recent conflict. And as Michael pointed out last week, there's a big issue about what does it mean, all the territories? Does it mean some of the territories? What does it mean exactly? And I'll talk about that in a minute.
It means to negotiate over the borders.
Sure. I mean, that's an Israeli narrative. I'm not saying it's not true, just saying.
No, that's the reason the wording is like that.
Well, there's a big question because there's a French version and there's an English version. The French version says that Israel was required to withdraw from the territories. The English version says from territories. And of course, there's a debate between the Palestinian and the way Arabs look at that and the way Israel looks at that. So they terminate, they also say UN Resolution 242, which is important, is that every country has to terminate all claims of belligerency, and they have to respect and acknowledge the sovereignty, the territorial integrity, and the political independence of every state in the area, and their right to live in peace with secure and recognized borders, free from threats or acts of force. That's a mouthful. I just want to recognize that that is part of UN Resolution 242, that every country has got a right to have recognized borders. That includes Israel, and they have a right to live without being threatened. UN 242 also comes back to the refugee issue, the Palestinian refugee issue. This is the only mention in the entire UN resolution of after 1967 of anything related to Palestinians, because it says there should be a just, quote unquote, a just settlement of the refugee problem, a just settlement. It doesn't say by who or the Palestinian refugee problem, which becomes a point of contention for the Palestinians. And finally, it says that every country should guarantee the territorial inviolability and political independence of every state in the area through measures including the establishment of demilitarized zones. So this is UN 242. Egypt, Israel, Jordan, other countries accept it. The only two countries that don't accept it, the only two entities that don't accept it is Syria and the Palestinian Liberation Organization. They reject UN 242. So Israel immediately moves after the war. It's accepted UN 242, and it starts to expand the jurisdiction of Jerusalem to include East Jerusalem, and it imposes Israeli law on that area and offers all Palestinian residents in that area Israeli citizenship if they want it, but they don't force them to have it. The city is now a lot bigger, and all of it's under one single Israeli government. Israel also adds 28 West Bank villages, expanding its size from 6, right? So to Jerusalem, 28 West Bank villages connected and annexed to Jerusalem. So Jerusalem expands in size from 6 square kilometers to 71 square kilometers, and it's all under, it's one single Jerusalem. all the municipality of Jerusalem. So it's important to recognize, like, as soon as the 67 war is over, the issue of what happens with the territory that was acquired becomes a part of this politics, right? Now, right? You can call it settlement. Like, people are settling, right? Israel is settling. Right near Jerusalem, the settlement of Gush Etzion is established, and in a block of Jewish settlements from that all Jews basically in this area from the 1920s that had been destroyed in the 1948 war. That is now part of Israel. Also in Hebron. Hebron is a settlement, a Jewish settlement. It's an area that was, of course, historically important. We've talked about it, and religiously important. The tomb of the patriarchs, according to Jews and according to Muslims and Christians, is there. And then there's a couple of more settlements in East Jerusalem. There are 3 in the Jordan Valley, and there's one in the Dead Sea area as well. More importantly than just these settlements, which are all in areas which were all Jewish, right, is the establishment of the movement for the whole land of Israel that is established right after the 67 war. The movement says, the Jews should be allowed to settle in every part of Greater Israel. And so by 1967, there's also a settlement in the Sinai, and there's also 6 more settlements in the Golan Heights. And I should note that by today, right, in 1921, there are about 132 settlements in 2021, established in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. About 670,000 Jews living in those settlements. 220,000 of those Jews live in Jerusalem. There are also, in addition to those recognized settlements, there are another 124 in 2021, 124 outposts in the West Bank that have been established without the recognition of the Israeli government. From just the initial settlement, just focused just around Jerusalem, Gush Etzion and Hebron, that was part of the plan that General Allon, Allon, had for thinking about what should Israel do now that we have this land, anticipating that Israel needs to have cushion in this area to guard against another attack if this becomes part of Israel's future borders. That was the Allon plan. So let me get out of this for a second because I feel like I can't see you guys. The United Nations sends their diplomat, Swedish diplomat Gunnar Jarring, to mediate the implementation of UN Resolution 242. Israel says, we are happy to negotiate direct negotiations with any Arab country leading to a peace treaty, which would then be followed by Israel's withdrawal from those lands that they seized in the 67 war. In contrast, Egypt and Jordan see it exactly the opposite. They say first Israel withdraws completely to pre-1967 lines, and you'll hear that a lot today, 1967 lines. So that's what Egypt and Jordan are saying. And then we'll start talking about a peace agreement under the rubric of the United Nations. So you've already heard a little bit of some of the things that Israel saw in this, right? First of all, as this starts in the 50s, right, this is the narrative. Israel's saying, look, even though we won, even there was this success in the Suez-Sinai conflict in 56, we still see ourselves as very vulnerable. And all we hear in the Arab press is how they're going to wipe us out. Nasser himself, who's the premier leader of the Arab people, not just Egypt, but very, very popular, tremendously charismatic. He's talking about, anti-Israel rhetoric all the time. And that can translate into real power for that effort to wage war against Israel. They feel like they're circled, right? There's Egypt on the southeast, Syria on the northeast, part of this United Arab Republic. And that reminds them of 1948 when they were invaded from all sides. The issues of water become really, really powerful. Syria is trying to choke Israel off by diverting the Banyas River, which is feeding the Jordan River. And from the perspective of Israel, they're diplomatically isolated as well. Egypt and the other Arab countries, they have the Soviets who are in their corner. The United States is kind of like on the fence. They don't forget that Eisenhower told Israel to stand down in the Suez crisis. And it's only reluctantly that Johnson is giving a yellow light here. And France is out of the picture with de Gaulle. So they feel like they're alone. The Soviets are pushing for war. They're supporting with arms Egypt and Syria, and is allied. Jordan is now signed a defense pact. They're surrounded. That's the way they see it. And so when they attack, they are either going to be destroyed from the perspective, from their narrative, from the Israel narrative, or they're going to have to attack first. It's an existential threat. They have no other choice. They don't want to initiate war, but Egypt's got all their troops at their border, and they're saber rattling all the time. They block the Straits of Tiran, which is a declaration of war, and so Israel makes a decision to do this. A Palestinian perspective, right? By the way, as a result of the way the Israelis see this, is they, as I think Robin was pointing at, Israel says, look, we were defending ourselves, so the land we acquired, we'll give back when a peace agreement is ready, right? We acquired this land because we were defending ourselves, not because we wanted to go out and conquer all this land. Now, the Palestinians see this quite differently. They basically see Israel as not just a menace to themselves, but as a menace to the entire Arab nation. It's illegitimate. It took their homeland, and it was a tool of Western colonial powers, and they have an expansionist appetite. Now, look at this. Look at this attack that Israel launches against Egypt, its ally. And so Palestinians say, look, we can't have any peace with these people. They will talk out of both sides of their mouth, but their actions speak louder than words. They also say, we talked about this last week, we don't want to have any resettlement of refugees in Jordan and Egypt. We want to go back to Israel. That's our country, Palestine. We want to keep that refugee problem alive because we need to say, look, we're not supposed to be in Jordan or Egypt or Syria. We're supposed to be in Palestine. That's our country. And they are fired up because of what's happened in Vietnam, defeating, as they see it, the United States. This is 1967, remember. The Viet Cong is putting the United States on the defensive. In Algeria, where radicals overthrew the French, liberating their own homeland through armed struggle. Fatah is convinced that the way to win against Israel is through a strategy called Tawreet, Tawreet. Obviously, it's phonetically spelled. And that is to create a catalytic war. Palestinians are going to initiate an escalatory process, and they're going to get Arab countries like Jordan and Egypt into a confrontation with Israel. Once that starts, Israel will be defeated and we'll go back to our homeland. But 67 wakens them up to something. First of all, Egypt accepts 242. Egypt wants its Sinai back. Jordan wants its West Bank back, Jerusalem back, whatever. Syria wants its Golan Heights back. PLO says, no, we are not going to negotiate with Israel. We just said in the Khartoum resolution a month ago, no negotiations, no peace, no recognition. Now UN 242, we're going to recognize everybody's borders. We're going to protect everybody. So the PLO says we're being abandoned by these Arab countries. They don't care about us. This idea of a catalytic war, that only works if the Arab countries can win a war with Israel. They obviously can't. So we are no longer in that process of trying to get these other countries to win a war. We have to take matters in our own hands, say the Palestinians. We're going to wage a war, an armed struggle against Israel from every location we can, from any location we can. And in fact, we think that Jordan should really feel an obligation to support guerrilla groups. They caused this problem in the first place. And for a brief moment in 1968, Fatah and the PLO in 1968 endorse a one-state solution. What they want is a single country, secular, Jews can be there too. We don't have a problem with the Jews. Everybody can have citizenship rights. We're not fighting Jews, we're just fighting the Zionists. That idea is dropped soon after that. Because they, in 68, say all Zionism is racism. All Zionism is anti-Arab racism. And we can't have, the Zionists will never accept equity with the Arabs. They only want a country just for the Jews. So from the perspective of the Palestinians, they've been abandoned, they've been isolated, the Arab countries have failed them, and that they now have to regroup and take matters into their own hands and wage armed struggle against Israel independently. So here's 67. Israel wins this dominant victory. The Palestinians dig in more so and are about to embark on a period of tremendous terrorism led by their new leader who's going to emerge in 68, Yasser Arafat. So let me just stop with that and open it up for questions or observations or statements. Before I call on you, Michael, I just want to say one thing.
Yeah, use me the last one. I should be the last one.
No, well, let me just say one thing. That is that this also leaves Israel in relationships with Syria, Egypt, Jordan, is holding land, having defeated all those countries. And even though they all say they're not going to deal with Israel on the Khartoum resolution, when they're together, they all accept United Nations UN 242, which says we'll recognize the borders, we'll recognize and not have belligerency, and we'll take our land back in return for peace. We just how they see the order of that is different. So let me start with Ria, and then Robin, and then Michael.
I wanted to ask if you think, or if anybody thinks, the fact that the various Arab nations, they're already nations, and that their essential abandonment of the Palestinians has exacerbated the Palestinians' sense of the need to have more terrorism against Israel, to be more recalcitrant to dealing with anything, and in a sense that they step on their own feet, and the chances of Palestinians having autonomy diminishes every time they clash in a terrorist attack, or by not dealing with Israel, or are they put in a corner and there's no other choice but to do what they're doing? Does anybody think that?
Well, I'll let other people answer. So,
I mean, not among us, among some of the writers.
Oh,
has that been
oh
posed
yes,
at all?
absolutely. I would tell you that many Palestinian writers will tell you that the emergence of the PLO and its growing militancy in this period of time is in fact a reflection of the failure of the Arab leadership to try to deal with in a constructive way the challenges of Palestinian statehood, or Palestinian autonomy, I should say. Even.
So is that the seeds that actually puts the Palestinians in a terrible sometimes self-perpetuated cycle that doesn't lead them into what they really want? Is that some of the thoughts of some of the writers, that type of thinking?
I think that is the concern of, particularly from Palestinian perspective, when Palestinian scholars like Rashid Khalidi would say our leadership, many of our leadership has failed. They had different opportunities to acquire some autonomy, some sovereignty, and part of this effort to sort of put faith in these other Arab countries, Egypt in particular, was just a misguided and terrible. And it's not just the Palestinians were not only at fault for that. Look, everybody, all the Arab countries followed Nasser into this war. Jordan didn't want to go to war, but because Nasser was so powerful, in part followed along, right? Despite the fact that the Israelis said, don't do it, we'll leave you alone, which is, Michael is absolutely correct about that, by the way. So yeah, I the answer to your question is this, history is always, hindsight is always 20/20, but I do think that that is the concern. And by the way, you'll see it from the perspective of Egyptian leadership with Anwar Sadat, as we'll talk about. When Anwar Sadat loses a war in 73 and says, okay, you know what, how about we try diplomacy instead? And then gets what he wants, right? That was a shift that the Palestinian leadership doesn't really ever fully embrace. And maybe they can't, but yes, I think that's a great question. I see two other hands, and I want to call on Robin first, and then Sylvia and Michael. You said you want to go last, so I'll let you go last.
No, call on Sylvia next.
Okay, all right. Go ahead, Sylvia. You heard it.
I heard it. Thank you. I'd like to ask a question that's a little divergent from what we were just talking about. This period of time, is this the period of time that in the United States, the more liberal left-wing party, or those of us, started really being critical of Israel because of that PLO saying that Israel was a racist nation now? No, not yet?
Not yet. In fact, Israel's still seen as the underdog And there's still a lot of support for Zionism because it comes out of the social democratic ethos on the left in the United States in the 60s. Now, by the late 60s, maybe so a little bit. There's this there is with the Black Power movement. There is a recognition that there's a very small hint that Palestinian rights similar to Black Power, but in the mainstream on the left, the Democratic Party, the left is more, except for the more radical circles, is supporting Israel still. It's not at all like it is today at all. I will say, one other thing I should say that was important, I want to say, was that, Egypt doesn't really see this as such a horrible loss. They say it's a setback. Naksa means setback. And from Nasser's perspective, hey, we just have to fight a war against Israel again to get back our land. And we're planning our next war. That's, from their perspective, they're going to go back and get their land back from Israel. That they lost this war because Israel had technological superiority. We were diverted in Yemen. We had too much stuff going on. That's our Vietnam. That was a big mistake. Egypt also felt that they had sent, America had called Egypt's chief diplomat to come to the United States to talk to them about standing down. And while they're doing that, Egypt's considering, well, maybe we should, they're talking to the United States about backing off. That's when Israel does the preemptive strike. So they thought they were double-crossed by the United States as well. So Egypt is convinced that they just messed it up, but that they could win next time. So that's pretty dangerous because that goes into 1973. There's another war coming. Yes, but I do think you're right now that I think about it a little more. By 1968, which corresponds to the end of the 67 war, now Israel's in a position of power for the first time. They win this war, commandingly so. They aren't the underdogs that they were in 48 or even 56. And so I think there's some radical left people who say the Palestinians should be the ones we support, Palestinian rights.
I think that this was about the time that I started hearing that from my lefty friends who I was among, but that started coming up about then. Not majorly, but there were some.
Yeah. Go ahead, Robin, please.
So, I mean, just like Sylvia, to me, when I hear that, and to me, it just rings true in terms of how institutionalized, what is the institutionalized support for Jews nationwide, and it's only when we're on the losing side of a battle will the world come to our come to our help and come to support us. But once we start defending ourselves rightfully and winning, oh no, those bad Jews, look what they're doing. That's an aside. I think there are two things that really strike me about what's going on in this situation, and they're different, I think. But one of the things, and Mel makes this comment that I keep going back to, which is, the West Bank was always occupied. It was occupied by Jordan. They didn't naturalize the Palestinians. The Palestinians still lived in refugees. It still lived in refugee camps from 49 to 67. And then in 67, all of a sudden, the West Bank is occupied. And that for me feels really, I can understand like the tension and the complications and the controversies from 1948 until 1967, prior to 1948, with all of that, I get it. I totally understand. But then when everything flips and everything suddenly becomes all about Israel and it's Israel's fault, and all of a sudden all of the history gets erased. And that's where I feel really wronged by history. And the other thing, Ria, when you were talking about the Palestinians really being that things might have been better for the Palestinians if their country, if the surrounding countries had stuck with them. It strikes me that one of the reasons why the Palestinians weren't successful in the early decades was because all of the surrounding countries had these competing needs and these competing conflicts and agendas that they wanted out of this land and this other sovereign country, which is why, like, ultimately, when it came to Jordan striking a peace deal, do we stay with the Palestinians or do we strike a peace deal with Israel? Jordan, Israel, all of these other countries are going to do what's best for their own country. And I see this as a great opportunity now for Palestine to band together, and they have this opportunity now to find the leadership, to become their own nation with a strong visionary voice. I mean, I knowing what happens in the end, if this is a movie, I'm hoping for everything to come out okay in the end, and the Palestinians finally get what they want. And of course, we know that even at that point, the Palestinians just haven't been able to. They've just been exploited by so many different leaders and so many competing values in their leadership. It makes me so sad.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's very potent what you were just saying. I will say that Jordan and then Lebanon have tremendous conflicts with the Palestinian, with the PLO in particular, who in the next, as we get into the 70s, there's a war between Black September is about Jordan and the Palestinians fighting each other, right? So there's other ways in which these countries don't want to, and as I think Michael pointed out earlier, that a lot of these countries say, the Palestinians are dragging them into this stuff with Israel, and they don't like it. Syria seems to be the one country that seems the least bothered by that over this history, over this many, as into the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, that they, but they're also physically, the Golan Heights really has a lot less to do with the Palestinians than anything, right? So, yeah, Ria, Michael, I called on Ria first before, so I'll call on you, and then Ria, you can have the last word.
No problem. I actually did not want to monopolize the time. That's why I said I should be last. Okay. What I'd like to add is this. In my opinion, it was the Arabic countries, much like Israel, who did not want a Palestinian state. They did not want just another failing Arab state. And it is the same thinking, in my opinion, today. That is why the Palestinian issue keeps propagating. And the second point I want to make is regarding the underdog. Israel was the underdog all the way up to and until Israel won the war. After that, it started to change. But until the war, everybody was worried about Israel, okay? And one other item is regarding it's a wrinkle in the issue of territories. Right after the 67 war, as you indicated, the Arab League had this Khartoum agreement with the three no's: no peace, no agreement, no borders, no nothing. And one more thing, they said. They forced Jordan to relinquish any rights and claim to the West Bank. Until then, Jordan claimed the West Bank. And so now the territory becomes a disputed territory. The Palestinians, of course, say this is ours. And the Israelis says this is ours. And that is what the negotiation is all about. And I'll tell you what happens next. The Israelis see to the future, okay, and the Palestinian thinks time works on their behalf. And the Israelis start to eat more and more of the cake. And the more they eat of the cake, there is less of the cake for the Palestinians. And that's where we stand now. The Israelis thought that if they keep on eating from the cake, the Palestinians will come to their senses, but they never did. And that is the issue that's happened today. As a matter of fact, with the fact that the Arab League forced Jordan to give up on the West Bank, they created today's problem. Otherwise, they all be Jordanian, and they would have had a country of their own. On top of that, as a matter of fact, that's exactly what happened a few years later when Arafat, with the Syrian military, were going to take Jordan. And Israel made a mistake after the United States requested Israel to intervene and to save Hussein. And they did save Hussein, and that's why there is a West Bank with Palestinians. Otherwise, everybody would be Jordanians.
I don't know quite about that last piece. That's a very interesting approach. I do want to look into that, and we'll talk about that coming.
True story. Israel was requested by Hussein
Jordan to help them against the Palestinian military.
Examine Arafat and the Syrian. They were already within Amman, the capital, and Hussein was begging them because he was going to be executed. And
well,
so,
I will say, I had I'll end with this, and I mean, I think it's a really interesting point because I once taught this class at Cal State Fullerton. It was during the pandemic, and I had a Jordanian student. I had a Saudi Arabian student that semester. I had a Palestinian student and a Jordanian student, taught the same class that I'm giving you, essentially. And he had some lineage, royal lineage, who were military, high up in the military. Anyway, he was talking about how in Jordan, they basically look at the Palestinians as having to they were trying to create a state inside of the state. And that the Jordanian King Hussein got very upset because Palestinian militants in the 70s were seeking to try to create their own country inside of Jordan. And that's when they finally, when it got violent, Jordan called on Israel to help it.
No, Jordan did not. That's not true, not true, Jordan. When the Syrians and the Palestinians with Arafat were going to take Amman and to kill Hussein, Israel intervened to save him, okay? You're talking Black September happened, and this was part of Black September, and after which the Jordanians started to kill them, all the Palestinians, and they ran away either to Israel, and to Lebanon, and that started the Lebanese civil war. But okay, I don't want to take more time. Thank you.
Well, let's stop with that right now. Let's unpack that in the coming months, in the coming weeks. The situation in Lebanon is very complex, as I tried to begin unpacking a little today, and I'll do the best I can to sort of unpack that in the next couple of few weeks too.
One quick comment. In some sense, the Palestinians have a real reason for removing Hussein. He is not Jordanian. He is Saudi Arabian. That is why they should take it over, and this is their country.
Okay. Well, All right, a lot to unpack. Let me just say, I've enjoyed this a lot, and this moment is just so powerful. There's a lot of people in Israel who think about 67 quite a bit, and what it means for Israel, because it was such a huge victory, but there was, in a way, an albatross around Israel's neck too, because it had territories that were now being disputed by its Arab neighbors, its enemies. So we'll unpack that going forward. Thank you for coming today, and I'm going to stop recording. I'm going to say shalom.